In the chaos of the Eastern Front, brutality became normal. Entire cities vanished under artillery fire. Villages burned overnight. Millions of soldiers disappeared into forests, snow, and mass graves without names. German troops witnessed horrors that shattered the human mind, while Soviet forces answered with equal fury as the war transformed Eastern Europe into a machine built entirely around death. But even in a conflict already drowning in unimaginable violence, there was one unit that developed a reputation so dark, so uncontrollable, that even hardened Nazi officers began filing complaints against it. A unit made not from disciplined soldiers, but from criminals, murderers, rapists, and sadists. They were sent into the bloodiest regions of the war not because they were honorable fighters, but because the Nazi regime believed they were capable of doing things ordinary soldiers could not. At the center of this nightmare stood one man, Oskar Dirlewanger. This is the story of the unit too brutal for the Eastern Front, the making of a monster. Before the world would know his name through terror, Oskar Dirlewanger had already spent years surrounded by violence. Born in the German Empire before the First World War, he grew up during a period of nationalism, militarism, and political instability that shaped an entire generation of future extremists. Like many young German men of his era, war became his identity early in life. When World War I erupted across Europe, Dirlewanger entered the conflict as a soldier and quickly adapted to the brutality of trench warfare. The war rewarded aggression, emotional detachment, and obedience to violence. For some men, those experiences became trauma that haunted them forever. For others, the violence itself became addictive. Dirlewanger distinguished himself through reckless aggression. He was wounded multiple times during combat, but his reputation among superiors was built around one specific trait: his willingness to continue fighting regardless of casualties or conditions. The trenches of World War I created men psychologically disconnected from ordinary civilian morality. Years of artillery bombardments, mud, starvation, corpses, and close quarters killing transformed many survivors permanently. Germany's eventual defeat in 1918 devastated the nation politically and emotionally, but for veterans like Dirlewanger, peace itself felt unnatural. The collapse of Imperial Germany threw the country into chaos. Communist uprisings erupted in major cities. Right-wing militias formed across the nation. Street violence became common. Former soldiers who had spent years killing on battlefields suddenly found themselves unemployed, angry, and disconnected from society. Dirlewanger became involved in the violent nationalist movements growing throughout post-war Germany. The atmosphere of humiliation after the Treaty of Versailles fueled extremism everywhere, and men like him were drawn toward ideologies promising revenge, order, and power. But even among radicals, Dirlewanger displayed disturbing tendencies. He developed a growing reputation for instability, alcoholism, and criminal behavior. Unlike disciplined military officers who maintained strict control over themselves, Dirlewanger increasingly appeared driven by impulses. Reports from the period described violent outbursts and unpredictable behavior. He struggled to function in ordinary civilian life. Violence remained the only environment where he felt useful. As the Nazi movement rose during the 1920s and early 1930s, Dirlewanger aligned himself with the new regime. The Nazis glorified militarism and rewarded loyalty above morality. His wartime record and nationalist background made him useful despite his personal instability. Through connections within the growing SS hierarchy, especially relationships with influential figures tied to Heinrich Himmler, Dirlewanger managed to avoid complete political destruction, even after serious criminal accusations emerged against him. One scandal in particular nearly ended his career entirely. Dirlewanger faced accusations involving the abuse of a young girl, along with multiple incidents connected to alcoholism and violence. In another environment, such crimes could have permanently destroyed him, but the Nazi system often protected men considered politically useful. Rather than disappearing from public life entirely, Dirlewanger eventually found his way back into military structures through the intervention of powerful supporters inside the regime. The Spanish Civil War gave him another opportunity to return to organized violence. Fighting alongside nationalist forces in Spain allowed him to rebuild his military reputation while remaining inside the growing network of fascist international cooperation developing before World War II. The war in Spain became a testing ground for future Nazi tactics and ideology. For Dirlewanger, it was also proof that extreme violence still provided him purpose and protection. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Nazi Germany had already begun reshaping Europe through conquest and terror. The invasion of Poland demonstrated the regime's willingness to use extermination, executions, and mass civilian repression as military tools. But as Germany expanded eastward into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the scale of violence escalated beyond anything Europe had previously witnessed. The Eastern Front quickly became a war of annihilation. This was exactly the kind of environment where someone like Dirlewanger could thrive. The Nazi leadership increasingly searched for specialized anti-partisan forces capable of operating in forests, villages, and occupied territories with complete ruthlessness. Resistance movements across Eastern Europe disrupted German supply lines, assassinated collaborators, and launched sabotage operations against occupying forces. Traditional military units often struggled with anti-partisan warfare because such operations blurred the line between soldiers and civilians. The Nazi regime wanted men capable of eliminating entire populations without hesitation. Dirlewanger offered a solution perfectly aligned with the darkest instincts of the regime. Instead of recruiting disciplined soldiers, the SS began assembling a special unit built around convicted criminals, violent offenders, and men considered expendable. Initially, the formation included poachers, because Nazi authorities believed hunters possessed tracking skills useful for anti-partisan operations. But the unit rapidly expanded beyond poachers into hardened criminals of every kind. Murderers, rapists, violent offenders, men with histories of brutality who were promised reduced sentences or freedom in exchange for service. The result was something far different from an ordinary military formation. It was the beginning of the Dirlewanger Brigade, and soon the Eastern Front itself would become their hunting ground. The criminal army of the Eastern Front. The men entering the Dirlewanger Brigade were not ordinary recruits. Most of them arrived carrying criminal records, prison histories, addictions, psychological instability, or reputations for extreme violence. In many cases, these were individuals rejected even by conventional German military structures. Some had spent years inside prisons for assault, murder, armed robbery, or sexual crimes. Others were soldiers already known for brutality who had become disciplinary problems within regular units. Under normal circumstances, men like these would never have been trusted with weapons again. But on the Eastern Front, the Nazi regime no longer cared about morality. It cared about results. And the results it wanted required monsters. The Eastern Front had evolved into something entirely different from the wars fought in Western Europe. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union was not designed simply to defeat an enemy army. It was a war built around racial ideology, extermination, starvation, and terror. Entire populations were categorized as inferior. Villages suspected of aiding Soviet resistance could disappear overnight. Civilians were often treated as extensions of the enemy itself. In this environment, anti-partisan warfare became an excuse for unrestricted violence. The SS leadership believed conventional soldiers were sometimes too restrained for these operations. Many Wehrmacht officers still followed certain military traditions, even while participating in occupation crimes. Some soldiers hesitated when ordered to execute civilians. Others reported psychological breakdowns after witnessing massacres. But Dirlewanger's men were different. The regime believed their criminal mentality made them ideal tools for the kind of warfare unfolding in Eastern Europe. The brigade operated with almost no moral boundaries. From the very beginning, discipline inside the unit was based on fear and brutality rather than military professionalism. Alcoholism was widespread. Beatings were common. Executions inside the brigade itself occurred frequently for perceived cowardice, disobedience, or weakness. Dirlewanger ruled through intimidation and violence, encouraging cruelty instead of controlling it. Unlike traditional commanders who maintained order through structure and strategy, he often amplified the chaos inside his own ranks. Witnesses later described the atmosphere surrounding the brigade as deeply disturbing even compared to other SS formations. Men competed through acts of violence. Looting became routine. Civilians in occupied territories quickly learned to fear the sight of the unit arriving near their villages. Rumors spread across Eastern Europe describing soldiers who burned homes for amusement, executed prisoners casually, and treated anti-partisan operations like hunting expeditions. And in many ways, that was exactly how the brigade saw itself. By 1942, the Dirlewanger Brigade had been deployed heavily into occupied Belarus, one of the deadliest anti-partisan theaters of the entire war. Belarus became a nightmare landscape during the German occupation. Vast forests allowed Soviet partisan groups to operate constantly behind German lines. Railroads exploded in sabotage attacks. Supply convoys vanished. German patrols entered villages and never returned. The Nazi response grew increasingly savage as frustration mounted. Entire regions became targets for collective punishment. Operations officially labeled as anti-partisan sweeps often had little distinction between armed resistance fighters and ordinary civilians. German commanders increasingly adopted policies where villages suspected of supporting partisans could be destroyed completely. Men were shot, women beaten or executed, children burned alive inside buildings, livestock stolen, food supplies confiscated. The goal was to terrorize entire populations into submission. The Dirlewanger Brigade became infamous during these operations. Unlike regular military units that sometimes attempted structured searches or arrests, Dirlewanger's men frequently descended into uncontrolled massacres. Survivors described soldiers setting homes on fire while civilians remained trapped inside. Others recalled public executions carried out in front of entire villages as psychological intimidation. In some areas, the brigade reportedly murdered people simply to avoid the effort of transporting prisoners. The violence escalated further because the brigade operated in environments where accountability barely existed. Remote forests, isolated settlements, destroyed infrastructure, and the general chaos of the Eastern Front created conditions where mass killings could occur with little documentation. Nazi authorities often accepted inflated reports claiming hundreds of partisans eliminated, even when many of the dead were unarmed civilians. But the scale of brutality became impossible to hide entirely. Complaints slowly emerged even within German structures. Some Wehrmacht officers viewed the brigade as dangerously undisciplined. Others feared the unit's actions were fueling even stronger partisan resistance by turning entire civilian populations against Germany. Reports described drunken violence, uncontrolled looting, and executions carried out without strategic purpose. Some officers argued that Dirlewanger's methods created more enemies than they destroyed. The SS leadership, however, continued protecting him. Part of the reason was simple: fear worked. Villages exposed to anti-partisan operations often became terrified into obedience. Survivors spread stories of unimaginable violence. Entire communities fled forests and resistance zones after massacres. To Nazi authorities obsessed with crushing insurgencies at any cost, terror itself became a weapon. Dirlewanger understood this perfectly. He encouraged his men to cultivate an image of unpredictability and horror. The brigade's reputation became psychological warfare. Civilians often abandoned settlements immediately upon hearing rumors that the unit was approaching nearby regions. Soviet partisans themselves began recognizing the brigade as one of the most dangerous formations operating in occupied territory. But the deeper the brigade descended into violence, the more unstable it became internally. Alcohol addiction spread through the ranks. Criminal rivalries inside the unit frequently exploded into assaults or murders between soldiers. Discipline deteriorated constantly. Many recruits viewed service less as military duty and more as legalized criminality under government protection. Looted alcohol, stolen valuables, and personal brutality became part of daily life. Even Dirlewanger himself appeared increasingly consumed by the atmosphere surrounding the brigade. Witness accounts later described him as volatile, often intoxicated, and obsessed with violence. He reportedly led operations personally at times, pushing his men toward even greater brutality. The line between organized military action and outright sadism blurred completely. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front itself continued collapsing deeper into catastrophe. Germany's initial rapid victories against the Soviet Union had stalled. Soviet resistance intensified across massive territories. Casualties mounted into the millions. Entire German divisions disappeared during winter offensives. Supplies became harder to maintain. Morale deteriorated. As the war dragged on, Nazi commanders increasingly relied on fear and extermination to maintain control over occupied regions. Units like Dirlewangers became symbols of this transformation. The brigade was no longer simply an anti-partisan formation. It represented the complete moral collapse of Nazi occupation policy in the East. Traditional military objectives increasingly disappeared beneath campaigns of terror designed to dominate populations through massacre. And the worst was still coming, because in 1944, the brigade would enter the place that permanently defined its reputation across history. Warsaw, the city that saw the monsters. By the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing around Nazi Germany. Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly from the east, destroying entire German formations and pushing toward occupied Poland. Across Europe, the illusion of Nazi invincibility had begun to die. Cities burned under constant bombardment. Refugees flooded shattered roads. German commanders struggled desperately to maintain control over territories already slipping away from them. But inside Warsaw, another storm was forming. The Polish resistance had waited years for this moment. The Polish Home Army, one of the largest underground resistance movements in occupied Europe, launched what became known as the Warsaw uprising. Their objective was both military and symbolic: liberate the city before Soviet forces arrived and prove that Poland could reclaim itself without Soviet domination. Thousands of resistance fighters emerged from hiding. Barricades appeared across streets overnight. German patrols vanished under ambushes. Nazi control over the city fractured rapidly as fighting erupted block by block. Berlin responded with fury. For Adolf Hitler, Warsaw was not simply another rebellious city. The uprising represented humiliation. Nazi leadership viewed the resistance not as legitimate fighters, but as enemies that needed to be annihilated publicly and completely. Orders soon circulated demanding the destruction of Warsaw itself. Civilians were no longer considered separate from resistance forces. The city would be crushed through terror. And among the units sent into Warsaw was the Dirlewanger Brigade. By this point, the brigade already carried a terrifying reputation throughout occupied Eastern Europe. Even hardened German officers knew its name. Reports of massacres in Belarus and anti-partisan operations had spread across military circles, but Warsaw would become something different. The scale of violence unleashed there transformed the brigade into one of the most infamous formations of the entire Second World War. The fighting inside Warsaw quickly descended into absolute chaos. Urban warfare consumed entire districts. Buildings collapsed under artillery fire while civilians hid inside basements without food, water, or medicine. Streets filled with rubble, smoke, and bodies. Resistance fighters launched ambushes from apartment windows, while German forces responded with flamethrowers, tanks, and mass executions. Every block became a battlefield. The Dirlewanger Brigade entered this environment with almost unrestricted authority. Witness testimonies from survivors described scenes of horror spreading through neighborhoods wherever the brigade operated. Civilians were dragged from buildings and executed publicly. Entire groups of men, women, and children were reportedly lined against walls and shot without interrogation. Homes were burned systematically, while wounded civilians remained trapped inside. Continued for hours without interruption. One area became especially infamous: Wola. The Wola massacre remains one of the most horrifying atrocities committed during the uprising. German forces, including the Dirlewanger Brigade alongside other SS and police formations, moved through the district carrying out mass executions on a staggering scale. Hospitals were attacked. Medical staff murdered. Civilians hiding in courtyards and basements were executed in groups. Witnesses described piles of bodies filling streets, while gunfire echoed continuously through entire neighborhoods. The objective was not simply military suppression. It was terror designed to break the city psychologically. German leadership believed overwhelming brutality would crush resistance morale quickly. Instead, the massacres intensified the hatred and desperation inside Warsaw. Resistance fighters understood surrender often meant death anyway. Civilians trapped inside the city watched entire families disappear overnight. Fires consumed block after block as the city itself slowly transformed into ruins. And throughout the destruction, the Dirlewanger Brigade gained a reputation for extreme savagery, even among German units already participating in atrocities. Some Wehrmacht officers reportedly viewed the brigade with open disgust. Others feared its lack of discipline endangered military coordination itself. Dirlewanger's men frequently ignored command structures during operations, focusing instead on looting, drinking, and uncontrolled violence. Reports emerged describing soldiers assaulting civilians, executing prisoners impulsively, and setting fires without tactical purpose. But the SS leadership largely tolerated the behavior because the brigade achieved one thing effectively: spreading fear. The psychological impact became enormous. Survivors later recalled hearing rumors before the brigade even entered certain districts. Families hid in sewers or collapsed buildings attempting to avoid contact with the unit entirely. Some civilians reportedly fled active combat zones, specifically because they feared encountering Dirlewanger's men more than artillery or bombing itself. The brigade's brutality also reflected something deeper happening inside Nazi Germany during the final phase of the war. By 1944, many traditional military structures were deteriorating. Germany faced catastrophic losses on multiple fronts. Entire divisions had been destroyed in the Soviet advance. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities daily. Supplies collapsed. Morale inside the Reich weakened constantly. In response, the regime increasingly embraced radical violence as both strategy and ideology. Units like Dirlewanger's became tools of desperation. The Nazi leadership no longer prioritized professionalism or discipline above all else. It prioritized fanaticism, fear, and total obedience. Criminal brutality became acceptable if it delayed collapse for even a short time. And in Warsaw, that philosophy reached one of its darkest conclusions. The uprising ultimately failed after weeks of brutal combat. Warsaw was devastated. Large sections of the city were systematically destroyed following the surrender. Tens of thousands of civilians were dead. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Survivors emerged into landscapes resembling the end of civilization itself. Burned ruins, shattered churches, collapsed apartments, smoke rising endlessly from the remains of streets where ordinary life had once existed. The Dirlewanger Brigade survived Warsaw, but its reputation changed permanently. Even within Nazi Germany, the brigade became associated with uncontrolled horror. Complaints continued emerging from military officials disturbed by the unit's behavior. Some officers argued the brigade had become militarily unreliable because of indiscipline and criminality. Others privately feared that men conditioned to such unrestricted violence could no longer function inside normal command structures at all. But by then, the Third Reich itself was collapsing too quickly for reforms to matter. As Soviet forces advanced deeper into Eastern Europe and Allied armies closed in from the West, the war entered its final catastrophic phase. German cities burned. Refugee columns stretched endlessly across frozen roads. Millions fled advancing armies while Nazi leadership issued increasingly irrational orders from bunkers and ruined headquarters. And somewhere within the collapsing Reich, Oskar Dirlewanger continued moving through the chaos his unit had helped create. But unlike many Nazi leaders who would face formal trials after the war, Dirlewanger's own ending would become surrounded by confusion, violence, and revenge. Because by 1945, even monsters were running out of places to hide.